action.
Welcome to day 4 of your NISL training. We're glad to have you back with us again after several months. As you know, 3 months ago we did days 1 through 3, and today we're going to try to connect that experience to our new learning about PLCs. So if you have questions or comments about days 1 through 3, just jot them down, and on breaks we'll try to cover that material and interweave it together with our work today.
Okay, so as Stevie said, we're hopefully going to make some connections here with looking at schools as professional learning communities. If you take a look on page 43 of your participant handbook, you'll see the overview for today. As you look at our work, our primary focus this morning is really just looking at the first hour of the training, where we're going to focus on schools as learning communities. We have 5 key objectives actually for today when we look at the day in its entirety. You have those in your participants manual as well. We have them on the overhead here. We're going to be looking at describing various strategies for building instructional capacity. We're going to discuss concepts related to knowledge management, and you read last evening about communities of practice and this notion of distributing leadership within schools. We're going to examine ways in which schools function as learning organizations. Some of those strategies may be new to you. Maybe some of those are looking at those strategies in a little different way. We're going to describe the need for systematic change in the way that we think about professional development than perhaps what we've done previously. And then the last goal for today is we're going to describe the concept of levers. And I think probably that is a very new term to most of you, as it was to me actually, until I read the pre-reading as well. So by the end of this particular session, you should be able to answer this question: what are the strategies for fostering a learning culture and creating a learning organization in your school? So as I mentioned, we're going to focus first this morning on thinking about schools as professional learning communities. We're going to review some of the current research as it relates to professional learning communities. As you read in your pre-reading last evening, you had a chapter to read from On Common Ground that was authored by Dr. Richard DeFore and Dr. Rebecca DeFore. That was entitled, What is a Professional Learning Community? You had Dr. Wenger's article entitled Communities of Practice, and that was just a brief introduction. We're going to be getting to that a little bit later this morning. And then you were asked also to complete the NICRAL checklist dealing with distributive leadership as it relates to professional learning communities. So as you look at page 43, as I mentioned, that's the agenda for today. You will see we're going to focus on the first hour, where we're going to be looking at schools as professional learning communities. So the deliberate strategies that we're going to focus on today really should help us acquire more awareness and knowledge about how schools can view themselves as professional learning communities. As you read in your pre-reading, DeFore stresses for us that PLCs are really not a thing. Rather, it's a key characteristic in how we operate and how we function, and has key processes and elements that just actually help drive the day-to-day operation of the school. And I think oftentimes we hear PLCs and that term just kind of thrown out there, and I think he brings us back to some solid foundational framework about that term and how it needs to really guide what we do on a daily basis. As you are aware from your reading, Dr. DeFore and Dr. Eaker have done extensive research on the importance of schools and the importance of functioning as a PLC. So for our first activity to start our day, kind of get the adrenaline going and the brain thinking a little bit, I'd like you to turn to page 45 for our first activity. You did read chapter 2 from On Common Ground, and that was the DeFore chapter about professional learning communities. So what we'd like you to do first is just individually list some of the key characteristics about a professional learning community that you might be able to recall from that chapter of reading from On a Common Ground. We'll give you a few minutes just to brainstorm that individually. And then our next step with that activity is to find a partner in the class, maybe somebody or in the group today, somebody that you haven't talked to previously in our first 3 days of training, so that you can share your ideas and see your collective knowledge and what you've come up with. After you're finished partnering then, as a team, what we'd like you to do is to see if you can reach some kind of consensus on what you believe to be 3 critical characteristics of professional learning communities. From there then, we're going to identify some common themes based on your brainstorming list and see how we can align those to the characteristics of a professional learning community.
Joe and I will circulate around the room and listen and learn from you as you share from your experience from reading the book as well as your own experience with PLCs. Now we go to Word document. After completing this exercise, both by pair sharing and individual work, we will have a list, and this was what our list might look like. So, characteristics that you have identified as important ones in your PLC, your learning community, include commitment, results or outcomes oriented, innovation, understands current reality, invested participants, trust, focused on student learning, focused on interventions, data driven, collaboration and working together collegially, a can-do attitude, collective efficacy, shared leadership and decision making, a sense of team and shared vision, focus on learning, not teaching. After you brainstormed your large list, you pair shared and shared out to the group, and we have identified, or you have identified, and we have identified together, those components that we think are the most important, the priorities. Innovation, trust, collaboration and working together, and a sense of team and shared vision. All of these components, these common elements, are really important in a professional learning community, and you are correct in identifying those as well as the other important components as well. So we have learned now that there are 6 key characteristics in a professional learning community, 6 themes that we find in common. The first one is shared vision, values, and purpose. We need to know where we're going, what our collective focus is. DeFore suggests that school staff focus on these key questions. What school characteristics and practices have been most successful in helping all students achieve at high levels? How could we adopt those characteristics and practices in our own schools? What commitments would we have to make to one another to create such a school? And what indicators could we monitor along the way to assess our progress towards our goals? When staff conducts these conversations, the ability to create a solid foundation for the school will create focus about the purpose and the value of why a school even exists. From these conversations, a more focused school vision and shared principles will result. It's one thing to create a focus, and yet another to shelve it or do nothing with it. So, when staff truly invests in the meaningful conversations about who we are and why we exist, the work of improving student achievement starts with the foundational purpose. The second key characteristic, shared leadership. In order for schools today to stay focused on our common and shared work, every stakeholder within the system must be invested and must share the belief of shared leadership. All individuals have talents and skills to bring to the table, not just the school leader, and all have responsibilities to the shared purpose, not just the school leader. And number 3, collective learning starts with and supports the concept that staff is willing to learn for the betterment of the organization. And through that collective learning, there is focused time and energy on our common goals for the sole purpose, the sole goal of improving student achievement.
So the other 3 areas that we want to think about when we focus more on a common theme as we look at professional learning communities is the one that Stevie just ended with on collective learning. We really connect this particular theme as well, and that's collaboration. In order to have collective learning, you need to be able to collaborate with each other and to discuss issues and make sure that all voices are heard so that there's some ownership and some buy-in as well. When we talk about professional learning communities, we're talking about teachers no longer working in isolation, rather than they're now functioning as a collegial collaborative group within the school. And these collegial groups will support the school initiatives that the school has prioritized. The 5th area, or common theme for professional learning communities, is the notion of innovation. Innovation is extremely important because without innovation and that creativity, we might be prompted to look at things how we've previously done them or the way that we've done business prior to now. What we really want to do is look at things differently, and how can creativity and new ways of looking at things prompt further exploration and discovery. The last area, of course, is trust. And in order for innovation and collaboration and collective learning to happen, it must be occurring in a trusting, trustworthy environment where all ideas are welcome at the table, limited judgment, if at all, and that folks are very very willing to share their ideas and their concepts for the betterment of the school. In fact, the one primary theme that is probably the primary function of a PLC actually is the theme or the notion of innovation. If you take a look on page 45 of your handbook, you will see there the NISL list, and they've actually coalesced those themes into 4 categories. We have them into 6, which is what Dr. DeFore has done for us, but the NISL list, you will see there, those are the characteristics that are aligned to the common themes as well. The next thing that we would like to do is to not only take the research and the learning that Dr. DeFore suggests for us in our reading and on Common Ground, but we'd also like to make the connection with Dr. Tim Waters' research out of the McCrell Leadership Lab in Denver, Colorado. He's done extensive work with his research team looking at the notion of balanced leadership. This meta-analysis that he has completed over the last 10 to 15 years really focuses on specific leadership attributes that are aligned to increasing student achievement. So if we dovetail the idea of schools functioning and operating as professional learning communities, we really want to look at those specific leadership attributes that will enhance the professional learning community's process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you now the graphic that actually is provided to us by the educational lab. And I think, Randy, you might have to shift over to that to look at that particular graphic. But I just want to walk you through certain elements of this particular graphic so that we can make the connection to professional learning communities. You'll notice around the graphic that we have this notion of what Tim Waters refers to in his leadership term. They refer to something called a purposeful community. And really, when we get into your communities of practice a little later today, you will see a great connection between a purposeful community, the notion of collective efficacy, and how we can do things as a team much better, and if we think we can do them as a team, much better as a team rather than in isolation. You'll also notice that around the graphic is this notion of leadership, and as Stevie mentioned, we are going to really focus on distributive leadership or shared leadership. It's not simply the school leader in the building or the district leader, it's all of us. And how is it that we are making sure that leadership is evident and in place at all times? And in the center here, there are 2 key areas that when we think about professional learning communities and leadership in general, we can't underestimate the importance of focusing on this leadership and the notion of just shared leadership, but we also can't underestimate the magnitude of change and how change creates a great deal of consternation for the majority of people, especially certainly in schools, especially when we're dealing with second-order change, which is a deviation from current practice or past practice. If we look at the meta-analysis even further, there are 4 key leadership attributes that we would like to suggest should be evident as well when we talk about professional learning communities and our day-to-day operation. It's the notion of understanding the school culture, that we have some sense of order within that culture, that we provide numerous opportunities for input from all stakeholder groups, and that the communication is two-way, and it's defined, that there are ways in which we intentionalize our communication and make sure that not only the guiding coalition or the leadership team working with school improvement and data-driven decision-making, but that all factions of our school environment, all stakeholders receive ongoing and pervasive communication. So to end our connection to PLCs this morning, Stevie's going to spend just a little bit more time talking about this notion of the magnitude of change.
Change is, as we've already discovered, a messy business. And Tim Waters, again, has tried to simplify his research on change and help us identify the components of change. So here we see his very simplistic graphic that talks about the order and phases of the change process, starting with creating a demand for change. Now, what can create a demand? It might be our existing situation. We might examine the data and realize that there's a demand for change. Our stakeholders may help us to understand that. And then we need to implement. Again, a very important phase of the change process. Manage the personal transitions. Monitor and evaluate. This process of change is not simplistic and it's not linear. It's like being in the middle of a tornado. It goes back and forth. While we move from one phase to another, we may still be creating demand for change in yet another area. And so it's the job of all the leaders in the process to manage this first and second order change. We might be taking risks here. It might be uncomfortable. The change process itself may be uncomfortable. The process we're in may be uncomfortable and urging us to make the change. So change could come out of all of those opportunities. We may have the drastic and desperate conversation about where we are and that we want to do better, and so that may initiate the change. And even as we improve, we still want to have continuous improvement, so that yet starts another cycle of change. So in order to implement the process, a shared vision, as we talked about earlier, is required from all stakeholders. This takes a commitment of work and diligence. And it's important for all stakeholders to understand not only where we are, but where we intend to go. So the shared vision is really important. Secondly, the current reality has to be thoroughly understood by all stakeholders so that we understand the impetus for change, understand where we're at and where we want to go. So whether it is a continuous improvement even after having had some success, or if examining our data requires us to change, that tension to move forward will be important for all stakeholders. So, as Joe said earlier, when we talked about the periods of change, the processes of change, the change process becomes even more important for everyone to understand. You can see here with first order changes, we might be going this way, we may step back. With second order changes, we're including this bottom loop. With first order changes, we go from implementation to monitor and evaluate. An easier process than second order changes, as we know. So Dr. Waters has tried to simplify both the process and the components of the process so that we can further implement what we want to do in school, which is benefit students and increase student achievement. So throughout the day, we've talked about PLCs. Personally, you've shared them. Collectively, you've come up with components. And we've had shared vision for the essential elements, the common themes in PLCs. All of these things together are creating an environment for change, collective change. We talked about also culture, input, communication, and order, the four components that are required in balanced leadership to support a second order change. This is new to many of us, and we'll have to examine it further as we move throughout the day. As Joe said, we're going to have new items to discuss as we build upon this foundation. So we're going to conclude this portion, take a 15-minute break, and then move on through the rest of our agenda. So we thank you for your attention, and we'll refer back to this information as we go forward. Thank you.
What, no applause? Really?